Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Vancouver City Hall Council Chambers for today's council meeting. It's July the 25th, 2017. We have quorum of council here gathered, and first acknowledge that we're on the unceded homelands of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And Madam Clerk, we're ready for the roll call, please.
Okay, Mayor Robertson's in the chair. Councillor Louis. Councillor Stevenson is absent from the chamber. Councillor Deal. Councillor Jang has leave of absence for personal reasons. Councillor Reimer. Councillor Ball. Councillor Carr. Councillor Affleck. And Councillor DeGenova. Mr. Mayor, we have a quorum.
Thank you very much, Madam Clerk. And we start today, before we dive into our agenda, with taking a moment to recognize and thank and acknowledge two community leaders who we have recently lost. And the first is Tracy Morrison, who is an Anishinaabe woman who chose the downtown east side as her home years ago. Tracy was an active community leader involved in many different community organizations. She was a relentless advocate for ending the war on drugs and the war on the poor. She fought hard for an Aboriginal Health and Wellness Centre, which is still in the works, and for safe housing, tenants' rights, among many other issues. She was a champion of many vulnerable members of the community. I was very honored to work with Tracy during her time as a member of the Mayor's Task Force on Mental Health and Addictions. Many of us worked with Tracy through that several-year process, trying to turn the corner on an intense crisis that we face as a city with mental health and addiction, and now overdose death tragedy. I know she will be incredibly missed and remembered by many as a relentless source of bannock bread, very tasty bannock, and smiles and hugs, incredibly warm and loving and generous in the community, and fierce, and a beacon for what is possible in our community. We will miss Tracy and remember her now. And the second Vancouverite that we are honoring today is Jim Wong Chu. Jim Wong Chu came from Hong Kong in 1961 to Vancouver. He was a visionary for his time who brought together diverse communities, gave local residents of Chinese ancestry a much-needed voice through initiatives like the Pender Guy Radio, which was the first Chinese-operated English radio station. Jim later developed the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop and Rice Paper Magazine, and dedicated his life to supporting others and building strong bridges between the cultures here in Vancouver. And through his grassroots work, Jim created the foundation for many award-winning Asian Canadian authors across Canada, really national impact in boosting opportunities for many Asian Canadian authors. And he is survived by his loving wife, Marlene, and daughter, Debbie, and many friends and family in the community, and will be dearly missed. So we remember Tracy and Jim today, two great community leaders who have passed and who we will miss. Okay, so just into council business now. We have just on the schedule, the agenda for today at 2 p.m. today, council will consider the unfinished business item. That was referred from the public hearing that was Thursday, July the 20th, which is the rezoning application for 500 to 650 West 57th Avenue. That's the Pearson Dogwood development. So that's at 2 p.m. this afternoon that we will go to that item specifically. So in the meantime, we have a report reference and the rest of the agenda to work through. Whatever we don't finish will come after the unfinished business item that starts at 2 o'clock. It'll be later in the afternoon, and a 6 o'clock public hearing, reconvening a public hearing at 6 p.m. So we also have in camera on the agenda. We're required to meet later this week. The reasons and authority under the Vancouver Charter are listed in the agenda. Would someone like to move that motion for in camera? Councillor Deal moved and seconded. All those in favor? Any opposed? That carries. and that in camera will start right around noon. When we have a good seamless time for a break, we will go into that meeting and then be back at 2 for unfinished business. So minutes are the minutes of the regular council meeting, July the 11th, 2017. Any corrections to those minutes? Moved and seconded adoption. All those in favor? Any opposed? That carries. Minutes number 2 are from the public hearing, July the 11th, 2017. Any corrections? Moved and seconded to be adopted. All those in favor? Any opposed? And that carried. Minutes 3 are from the regular council meeting that followed Standing Committee on City Finance and Services, July 12th. Adoption is moved and seconded. All those in favor? Any opposed? That carries. And minutes 4, the last set, are from the public hearing, July the 20th. Any corrections to those? Seeing none, moved and seconded. All those in favor? Any opposed? And that carries. So minutes are all adopted into the books. And we are on to our consent agenda items. We have 2 communications, 5 administrative reports, and 9 policy reports on the agenda for consideration. And council has received a request to speak to Administrative Report 5, which is the Vancouver Waterfront Initiative. So should council wish to hear the speaker, that report can be referred to the Policy and Strategic Priorities meeting to be held tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. Someone want to move? Councillor Reimer?
Second. Mayor Robertson, I understand the speaker may not being familiar with council procedures may not be available much later in the day when this is likely to come up. So if I could, and council could indulge me, I can determine that, and perhaps we can leave it on the agenda today until we're done the report reference, and I will know at that point.
So we can hold it for now.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay, we'll hold Administrative Report 5 until later in the meeting. Come back to that. And any member wish to hold any of the other reports for debate or questions to staff? Councillor Carr?
Yes, thanks, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to hold Administrative Report 3 and Policy Reports 2 and 3.
Okay. And Councillor Reimer?
Mayor Robertson, I just had a question about report reference 2, the recommendation for the 2017 contingency budget for the overdose crisis. Given the large number of speakers we have signed up for it, it seems preferable to have the presentation tomorrow when the speakers
Yeah, we will do the presentation tomorrow. We'll get to that shortly following this consent agenda piece. Anyone else want to hold a report for debate or separate vote? Questions? Okay, anyone wish to declare a conflict of interest on any of the other items? No conflicts of interest, so Councillor Louis, you will move consent agenda items. That's adoption of the recommendations before council contained in the communications and the reports, with the exception of A5, which is being A5, A3, P2, and P3, which are being held for debate. Or questions to staff. So moved by Councillor Louis, seconder for that. Councillor Carr will second. Any debate on the consent agenda? All those in favor, consent agenda? Any opposed? None opposed. So that carries unanimously, and that means we have adopted the following reports and recommendations within them. 2017 council meeting schedule revision, and Communications 2 is the replacement of council member on various council appointed bodies. Administrative Report 1 is the closure of a portion of street for building encroachments, 4295 Dunbar Street. Administrative Report 2 is 2017 Q2 capital budget amendments and closeouts. And Administrative Report 4 is the 2017 Aboriginal Healing and Wellness grants. And Policy Report 1 is the Heritage Revitalization Agreement Amendment for 1451 Angus Drive, Rifle Residence. Policy Report 4 is the False Creek Flats Plan Implementation, Policy and Bylaw Amendments. Policy Report 5, CD1 rezoning, 618 West 32nd Avenue. 6 is CD1 rezoning, 6137 Canby Street, Chinese Presbyterian Church. 7 is the East Fraser Lands Official Development Plan, Development Phasing Amendment. 8 is the 2017 Inflationary Rate Adjustments to Density Bonus Contributions. That's revised on July 21st, 2017, page 7. And finally, the last policy report, Heritage Density Bank update and zoning amendments to support heritage conservation. So we have approved all the recommendations within those reports, and the others will come back later in the meeting. And that means we're on to our first report reference. Maybe for the sake of clarity on the second report reference is regarding the recommendations for the 2017 contingency budget for the overdose crisis. And we received requests to speak to this item. So should council wish to hear the speakers, we can refer both the staff presentation, I think for context, and hearing from speakers to tomorrow. And we'll just deal with the report reference on Housing Vancouver update. Would someone like to move referral? Councillor Reimer?
Yeah, I'll move. Mayor Robertson, I might also suggest as chair for the meeting tomorrow that we move it over and put it as the second item right under the housing report, so that those, I think we're up to about 13 items on the agenda tomorrow. So I want to make sure that we don't have a long list of speakers waiting through the other 12 items for this one. I'm not sure that we can give time certainty because I don't know how long the housing report will be. I might encourage councillors to email questions about reports if they have them in advance, just to help with timing tomorrow. We have a long day today and another long one tomorrow.
Yeah, that's a good point. So Councillor Reimer moves, a seconder for that. Councillor Stevenson, that's referring it to tomorrow's meeting, and as the chair, it sounds like you can vary the agenda when the meeting begins, but are signaling it will be the second item following the housing update, so that the many speakers who've signed up can hopefully speak in the morning. Later in the morning, I would guess. So we're ready for the question on that referral. All those in favor? Any opposed? That carries. So we will do that presentation and hear speakers tomorrow on the contingency budget for the overdose crisis tomorrow morning. And that means we are going to now hear first report reference. It's a Housing Vancouver update. And we have here Gil Kelly, who is our General Manager for Planning, Urban Design and Sustainability, to kick things off. And I believe Edna Cho will be right there to roll it out from there.
Good. Morning, Mayor and Council. Gil Kelly, General Manager for Planning, Urban Design and Sustainability. We're here to present to you today a kind of mid-course update on the 10-year housing strategy for Vancouver, something we're tentatively calling Housing Vancouver, which we intend to deliver to you at the end of the year. But here in late July, we have some news to bring you in terms of our thinking around targets for housing production and conservation going forward that we're orienting a lot of our actions around. And so that's really kind of the heart of today's update. So I wanted to do a couple things just to frame that, and then I'll introduce Edna Cho, who's a Senior Planner for Housing Policy and Planning, who will be giving the bulk of today's presentation. So if we can call up the, okay, great. So I wanted to just begin because you're going to see a lot of data and you're going to hear a lot of numbers, just kind of reminding you all at the front end. This is first and foremost not about housing, but about homes and people. And the Vancouver situation is quite dire, as you know, but it's important to take a break from the numbers for a moment and think about how people are perceiving this. So you can see a couple of quotes here that we got through our recent engagement. And by the way, Edna will also be reviewing for you kind of comprehensively what we heard in our engagement over the last few months since we were here in March. But you can see that people who are working full-time are just finding it impossible to even find a place to rent. People who are thinking about starting families, and we're finding this through the ranks of even the city workers here, are just unable to stay in Vancouver and raise a family given the current situation. And there's a real perception that as we kind of grow in our global status and we grow as a city, that we may just become a city for the very rich and perhaps the very poor, but really Do we want to be like Manhattan or like London, where most people, working people, are priced out? And then there are changes in the most recent census data that shows that actually some of our traditional family neighborhoods are hollowing out. There are not as many kids there as there once were. And so begging some questions about, well, how do we revitalize our neighborhoods for families and the middle class? So what we're going to do today and tomorrow is kind of divide, because there's a lot of material, the whole housing update here into two segments. Today, we're going to do sort of the big picture overview, get clear on the overall targets for new housing production, and to talk too about our initial thinking about the need for conservation and renewal of existing rental housing stock in particular. We'll describe some early actions, including the need to engage senior government when we're feeling quite hopeful about that. And then you will note also that there are companion reports on the agenda which go to some early actions, including the character homes piece, the Grandview Woodlands new duplex zones, and the False Creek Flats district schedule. So those all play a part in some way in just making early actions, even as we take a few more months to deliver the overall 10-year strategy. And then tomorrow, part two will be led by Kathleen Llewellyn-Thomas in Community Services to really dial in on that lowest 30% in particular, including the lowest 15%, talking about strategies and actions to get at that, including work with the province and with renewed hope that the federal government will also be supporting a number of those things, because that's an area where we really need, we can do as much as we can do, but we really need senior government help. So that's going to be the topic and the focus for tomorrow, although we'll cover that generally today as well. Just to remind you, the Housing Reset was launched by Community Services back in September of 2016. In March of this year, we came to you with some emerging directions, and kind of the big news there was that we don't have a shortage of supply in Vancouver, we have a shortage of the right supply, and that is to say we're not really matching housing production with incomes. That is to say we're not really meeting the demand of Vancouverites out there. We're producing a supply that may in fact largely be oriented toward real estate investment and not toward people's needs in the city. So we've taken some interim months here between then, March, and now to consult with the public on those emerging directions that we described about how to approach that right supply question. And so Edna will be talking to you today about what we heard from the public generally about some choices over the last few months. And then we've consolidated those with further analysis around specific housing targets that would address those different income levels, and that's the heart of today's piece. I just wanted to say, I'll give a bit of context in a moment and then turn it over to Edna, but I want to sort of give you the punchline early here, and we'll come back to this throughout and at the end of the presentation today, is that we really see a need to shift housing production, new housing production, toward rental supply. That's not to say that we would not be producing any strata units, but that we need a fairly aggressive target here to be able, and incentives around rental to shift the production of more housing toward rental, because in many ways that's the only affordable option for many of those income bands. Actually going up fairly high in the workforce ladder is really rental options. And we want to make sure, because rental prices as the market continues to grow will increase, that we reserve a portion of that new rental supply for permanently affordable housing. And we'll talk more about that and a pilot program we have in mind to really dial in on how those percentages will work. We also at least want to prefigure some additional work we have to do in the coming months about how we preserve the very large rental housing stock that's already on the ground in Vancouver, even as that building stock ages and needs to be renewed. And finally, a big move here is to really increase the investment in low-income housing options and homeless services, and really with the assistance here of senior governments. And Kathleen's group will really dive into that tomorrow. So that's, if you take nothing away from today's presentation, those are the big things that we're focusing on between now and refining these strategies in December. So I'll just take a few minutes here because we tend to think of this as a Vancouver only challenge and not really fully understand all the reasons behind the what we're dealing with here. So I want to take just a few moments to talk about that. There are actually a lot of factors engaged in the housing price inflation and cost of housing crisis that we're in now. Like many successful cities and prosperous cities are experiencing. The one here that I would discount the most is the constrained land area, because really it's how we use land efficiently within the boundary, not whether we have an urban boundary or not. And that's been proven in studies elsewhere in the United States, for example. But one I wanted to focus on particularly was this notion that there is a worldwide demand. You see on kind of the lower left arc there, worldwide demand for housing investment. And that, more than anything else, I think has really been spiking the supply toward the high end and toward ownership, away from more stable production. In fact, there's a worldwide recognition now of this phenomenon. You can see here the notion of fiscalization of housing. That is to say, it treats housing really for the first time in global history as an investment commodity. Buying, trading, selling, getting a good pre-sale agreement and then flipping the unit. These are growing trends in the global market, and Vancouver as a beautiful, attractive city and a safe haven for investment is certainly one of those markets. And so I just wanted to let you know that it's really reached the heights of the UN here as a global phenomenon, and that's a huge driver of what we're seeing. And frankly, we've had encouraging discussions with the development community here about the advantages of producing more rental even to investors. It's just a very different kind of investment. So part of what's fueling this or augmenting that phenomenon is very low interest rates, and those will remain low for a while, even though they may tick up slightly. But you can see the trend line here for interest rate, which really makes real estate investment extremely attractive, both for the individual investor and for syndicates and larger scale investors. Vancouver's not alone in Canadian cities. You can see the price increases here in Toronto and Montreal compared to Vancouver. Vancouver had the highest starting point and it has continued to escalate. So you can look from 2007 to now, your average resale of a home price has gone from the high 500s now to about $1 million or very close to it. And then to purchase those homes, of course, often requires taking on a mortgage. And you can see here the sort of long-term average of what that means for a household and how we've crossed above that line and are staying above it. So it just means that younger people in particular are having a lot of trouble getting into the ownership market here, and that doesn't seem to be a phenomenon that's going to be eased anytime soon. We also are very successful in creating jobs here, and we're seeing that increasing, and including pay scales, at least at the upper end of the job market. But for those at the middle end of the job market and the lower end of salaries, they're seeing their salaries not going up at the same rate as housing costs. And so, again, we're doing a good job of serving those people at the top end, but not so much in the middle and below. And the fact that there is so much employment, of course, is also tightening the supply of housing. So again, prices going up. Within the region here in Vancouver, we're seeing prices continue to rise throughout the region. So you can see the big spike here that's gone up in the Vancouver region from 2013 until now, 2014 really. So just in a 2-year time frame, which is why we're hearing about this crisis every day. These are the actual numbers. And also, we have a very tight rental market. Vacancy rates here are plotted on these graphs. So you can see that although we've ticked up a little bit in the last 2 years in the city of Vancouver because we've brought on a record amount of supply. It's still not easing those rates to the point where it's a healthy market. And there's some other demographic changes going on. As I mentioned this before, you can see districts of the city here from the latest census information we have about increase in sort of neighborhood populations, with the most in Mount Pleasant and downtown. But you can see in the lower left part of the Vancouver geography that there are many traditional family neighborhoods that have actually lost population. And here is kind of how it all shakes out for the average household, with the lines going across from left to right. There are the median incomes for singles and then for families. And then you can see here the costs of new housing greatly exceeding the ability to pay for those incomes. So again, another major change that we've been seeing. And these are different size of units going across the graph. So studio, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, and 3 bedroom. So particularly for families, 2 and 3 bedrooms, the monthly cost of condominium ownership, for example, or even the average rents are substantially exceeding their ability to pay. And here's how it kind of shakes out by sort of the typical occupations, for example. So those same lines there, the ability to afford, for example, ownership for a 1-bedroom condo is that top dashed line. Income required to rent a 1-bedroom condo, is the next line down, and then the bottom line is the income required to rent a 1-bedroom apartment. And so you're seeing that many of the salaries for kind of clusters of wage earners are falling well below these lines. So it's only really the management classes and above that have options in the housing market. The others are quite strained. Including a broad range of workers from the trades and manufacturing through a lot of the administrative, business and finance and health professionals are just getting squeezed out of the market. You've heard some of this before, but it's nice to get the actual data in front of you today as the backdrop here. And the last couple of slides I just wanted to focus in on here. The people hit hardest, of course, are those at the bottom of the ladder, and we'll get into more of this tomorrow. But about 18,000 renter households are spending more than 50% of their income on rent. And that's opposed to the sort of industry standard of 30% of your income should go, your gross income should go to housing. So clearly people are having to and choosing to in some ways spend 50% or more of their income on housing. And just to let you know, the wait list, for example, is close to 5,000 people waiting for social housing in Vancouver. And the affordability of the SRO inventory has actually been decreasing relative to people's ability to pay. So you can see the 43% decrease there in SRO rooms that are available to those at the provincial assistance levels. So that's from 2007 until now, but a very substantial decrease there. So we have a big demand, if you will, issue to solve in these categories. And then finally, we often don't isolate seniors in this discussion, but in fact, in some ways, they are living in isolation. And they are the largest growing demographic over the next decades in Vancouver. So clearly the 65 plus category, years of age category, is the fastest growing cohort in Vancouver over the last period of time. These are the 5 years between 2011 and 2016. Our latest information shows that bulge, if you will, in the population of seniors will continue over the next 2 to 3 decades. Not that there won't be young people in need as well, but that we often don't pay attention to this group. And they're not all well off. Many of them are fixed income, many of them are renting, are feeling the squeeze as well, have very few housing options if they want to move. And then finally, this missing middle cohort that we've talked about so much. Again, these are workers that we need to support businesses and government in the city as workers. They are feeling squeezed out, and ultimately employers are going to feel that squeeze as well. So many people are delaying pursuing ownership. Some are living at home rather than renting. And so the populations here that we really need to be a healthy city, students, workers, and families are really finding that they can't stay in Vancouver and are leaving. So with that rosy picture, I want to turn it over to Edna Cho, who's been our star senior planner in this effort and really has been leading this work for us for the last several months, including the public engagement that we had, a very robust public engagement over the last 3 years about options about what we ought to do about this. So let me just introduce Edna.
Welcome.
Good morning, Mayor and Council. I'm Edna Cho, Senior Planner in Housing Policy, and I'm going to walk you through the rest of the presentation, starting with the public engagement results. So over the last 3 months, we've engaged over 10,000 participants in our process. The purpose of the engagement was to test the emerging directions adopted by Council at the end of March, confirm priorities, gather additional ideas, and really understand people's appetite for change. And we did this in a number of ways. We had 2 online public surveys. We held a big conversation pancake breakfast where we brought together a diversity of residents across Vancouver, owners and renters and people of different age groups to discuss their housing opportunities and challenges. We had embedded consultations where we piggybacked onto a number of existing planning open houses, as well as targeted stakeholder engagement and through social media. What's been different in this process versus other processes is that we've had very high participation from renters and people under 40. So in fact, the majority of participants were renters and people under 40 years old. In addition, we've had a significant proportion of participants who aren't in the either in the ownership or rental market, but are living at home or struggling to enter into the market. So that's been a new group that we've engaged. As well, we've had a number of people engaged in the process for the first time. So at our big conversation event, about 50% of participants had never been had never attended a city event before. So what did we hear? Well, we learned that residents love the city. They love the diversity of the city, and they're willing to make compromises to stay. In terms of renters, the top trade-offs, what they're doing to compromise, well, they're spending, a lot of people indicated that they're spending too much on rent. They're living with not enough space, or they're living with roommates and family, and they feel that their housing is temporary. And some of the quotes that we heard from people are things like, my biggest challenge is to have my rent increase every year when wages have remained the same. We learned that families are also making similar trade-offs. They're compromising on space and living in not enough bedrooms. They're spending too much on housing. They're renting instead of owning and really putting roots down, as well as living in an apartment rather than a ground-oriented home. And then some of the things that we heard from families are quotes like, we sit around a coffee table to eat dinner. There's no room for hobbies, contemplative space, or storage. So all this is leading to renters feeling very insecure about their future. 67% of renters aren't sure if they're going to be here in the next 3 to 5 years, and the main reasons being affordability. They can't afford to stay with rent increases, or they're looking to own, or they're at a stage in their life where they need more space. And a lot of people also talked about how many people they know have moved away from the city, and they really can't afford to live in Vancouver anymore. So given the affordability crisis, we've noticed that there's a shift in people's preference for housing. And we asked the question, given your budget and housing preference, what types of housing would you be looking for in your next move? And what the results here show renters at the bottom of the chart and owners on the top. And what we find here is that renters have indicated that 60% of renters have indicated that they're looking to move into a low-rise apartment, so that's up to 6 stories, in their next move. 40% have indicated that they would consider a mid-rise apartment. form, and that interestingly 30% are looking for an option in high rises. In terms of owners, so these are people already in the market. The majority of people are looking for a ground-oriented option, so a townhouse option, as well a third are looking for low-rise apartments, so up to 6 stories. We found that there was support for the emerging directions that were approved in Council in March. These are listed in the graphic on the right of the screen here. And we asked this question in 2 ways. The first, whether the emerging directions, the priorities, will have an impact on you and your family. And as you can see here, the emerging directions that resonated most with residents are to create more the right type of housing, so that's better matched to incomes, as well as to increase protection and security for renters. And you can see here that addressing homelessness only got 15% of support. However, when we asked this question again in a different way, we asked them, do you think any of these priorities will have an impact on the city as a whole? You can see here that addressing homelessness moved up to the 3rd priority. And that really speaks to the fact that residents want to see changes made on this front. We tested a number of values through this process. We asked people what they thought around diversity, creating diversity of housing that reflects the people who live here, security, so that's speaking about homes first, and providing security of tenure. Connection, so this is speaking to having housing that provides a sense of connection to your community. And what we found, of course, was that affordability was the most important value by residents, although there was general support for all the others as well. And people felt that the main driver of unaffordability was investment pressure in this commodification of housing. We also asked people if there were any values missing, and the one that came up over and over again was this notion of equity. And so this is speaking to people wanting to see equity in terms of income, so more planning for renters, and also intergenerational equity, so planning for young people. We also heard this notion of equity as it relates to geography, so people really asking us to create more diversity across all neighborhoods in Vancouver and not just in the east side. So security of housing is critical in a tight rental market. We heard lots of heartfelt stories around the challenges that renters are facing. And people said things like the rent is already too high, and with every rent increase each year, it all adds up, making it unsustainable to stay. We also heard a lot about people being evicted, and people saying things like, I've been evicted twice in the last year due to landlords deciding to take over the property and sell and demolish. So overall, I would summarize the public consultation to say that there are high expectations and appetite for action. Residents are willing to change their preferences and expectations in light of the housing crisis, and they're expecting governments to do the same. And so this means changing the way that we think about housing and contextualizing it in a broader context, as well as changing the way that we work with other levels of government and partners in new and innovative ways. So what will the city specifically be doing to address the housing crisis? So today we're going to share with you our 10-year interim housing targets that will be set by housing and income types. We'll report back on some early actions on ways that we're already pivoting our existing work to align better with Housing Vancouver. We'll be bringing back to you a final strategy in November with a full complement of actions and begin implementation over the next year. So this next section is about our interim 10-year housing targets. So we know that Vancouver is enabling a lot of new supply. We often hear that a solution is to create more supply, and we have been enabling housing at a very healthy rate over the last 10 years. Last year was a record year for us, almost 9,800 starts in the city. We also know that Vancouver has been enabling more rental housing than all the other municipalities in the region combined. And we also have existing housing targets that we've been working very hard to deliver. And you can see here that we've been meeting or exceeding our targets for purpose-built market rental and laneways, but more partnerships, we need more partnerships in order to deliver on our social housing and supportive housing targets. We know that we need to do more than what we've been doing in order to retain the diversity that exists in our city today. And you can see here that Vancouver has a great mix of tenures and incomes, but people are feeling that this diversity is being threatened because there are some key gaps in the housing market. And there are three main gaps, and these are that there isn't enough private rental for singles earning less than $50,000 a year. Compared to 10 years ago, the average rent of a one-bedroom unit was affordable to an income of $35,000, but now you need an income of over $50,000. The second gap is for families. There aren't enough market rental units that rent for families earning between $50,000 to $80,000. And finally, if you're a family wanting to get into home ownership, you need an income of over $150,000. So with those gaps in mind, we'll be taking a new approach to setting targets, and it's based on the following four things. First, we really want to retain the diversity of the city and create housing that is in line with local incomes for families, young people, and seniors, as well as include new targets for missing middle forms, including ground-oriented housing and family-sized apartments. We want to prioritize the creation of rental housing in order to meet the greatest needs, and this includes setting ambitious partner-supported targets to deliver housing targeted to the homeless population and those who are most vulnerable. It also means that we want to capitalize on the strong private market interest in creating purpose-built market rentals, as well as to investigate the potential to improve affordability in those market rental units. And we know that in order to do that, we need to meet and exceed the estimates of baseline demand identified by Metro Vancouver. So we heard overwhelmingly through the public consultation process a strong desire to course correct and not to continue down our current road. So in order to shift towards the right supply, we need to go beyond Metro's demand estimates as well as what's in our business as usual pipeline of 47,000 units. We also heard from the public that the right supply isn't just about income, but it's also about housing that's in the right location, that's the right household type, so looking at the appropriate number of bedrooms. It's about form, providing opportunities for renters and owners through different types of tenures, as well as providing housing with support. So we've incorporated all of these factors into our new 10-year interim housing targets. So here what you can see in these targets is that we will be creating opportunities for both renters and owners. So you can see that in the rows along the top. As well, we'll be creating targets targeted at specific incomes. Those are also on the rows at the top. As well, along the side, you can see that we've set targets based on the form. So whether it's a low-rise, mid-rise, high-rise, as well as infill and townhouse and ground-oriented forms of housing. The total will be 72,000 new units. The other thing to note here is that our old housing targets were organized by the housing continuum, and we've included that in the bottom color-coded line there for you for reference. So that included housing types such as social, supportive housing, purpose-built rental condos. We've color-coded those so you can see how that aligns with these new housing targets. What's new here is that we've also included some targets for coach houses, townhouses, and infills due to the strong public feedback we got to include ground-oriented forms of housing. We also note that you can see the priority for delivery is going to be for incomes below $50,000, and you'll be hearing a lot more about that in tomorrow's Part 2 presentation. Okay. Another new idea through this interim targets is the idea of setting targets for below market rentals, and these are units that can be provided either by nonprofits or private developers. Through the public consultation process, we heard a lot about renters who who don't qualify for social housing but also can't afford rents in the private market. And so we set below market rentals 4,000 units for renters with incomes between $30,000 to $80,000. And what we're seeing, what this is hoping that these rentals can be located in 100% rental buildings with a proportion of the units secured long-term at below market rental rates. And this is something that we're already testing in the Canby Phase 3 through Municipal Town Centre, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So in terms of some highlights, how these new supply targets will better match incomes. So overall, the new targets will be 70,000 housing units over the next 10 years. And we need these units in order to shift towards the right supply. This will be doubling the baseline demand estimates provided by Metro Vancouver. We set very ambitious targets to meet needs of low-income residents, so over 12,000 social and supportive housing units, and this is 50% more than our previous 2011 targets. And again, you'll hear a lot more about this tomorrow in part 2 of the presentation. We're also prioritizing rental to meet the greatest needs. 2/3 of new homes will be rental, including 20,000 new purpose-built market rental units over the next 10 years, and this is 4 times above our previous targets. We also seek to retain the diversity of incomes in the city. 50% of homes will serve households earning under $80,000. Prioritizing family housing, approximately 40% of new homes will be suitable for families. As well, we've included a target of 10,000 units of ground-oriented forms targeted for families and downsizing seniors. So while these new interim targets are ambitious, it's important to note that the existing need is very significant for low and moderate income households. So if you look at what the existing need is today, and this is made up of households spending more than 50% of their income on rent, the current homeless individuals in the city, as well as people living inadequately in SROs, that would give us a total of 24,500 households in existing need today. Plus, we expect that there will be growth in low and moderate income households over the next 10 years. If we look at homelessness is projected to increase by 6% a year, plus growth in low and moderate income households would add an additional 30,000 households, bringing the total overall need by 2026 to about 55,000 households. So given this very big number, we know that new supply alone can't meet all of this need of this 55,000. However, the city's new targets can meet 42% of the need, addressing incomes under 80,000 by providing market rentals. And so we can meet this need, 42% of the need by ourselves without partner support. However, the balance, we will need support from from senior governments and other partnerships. So we have included the ambitious target of 12,000 units in our interim targets, which we will need partner support, and that could help meet an additional 24% of need, but that still leaves a balance of about 30% of need that will be unmet. So we will need to retain and enhance affordability in the existing stock and work with other levels of government in order to help meet and address that unmet need. So we need to work with our provincial partners by advocating for changes to the RTA and additional measures such as rent supplements or income assistance programs and poverty reduction strategies. So new supply is only part of the answer. The need is significant. City tools can meet 42% of the need on our own, but it's going to take more than 10 years to fully course correct. And in order to fully course correct, we will need sustained and long-term investment and action from our partners. The city will also do its part to retain and enhance affordability of the existing rental stock. We have regulations in place through our rate of change regulations in the SRA bylaw to protect the existing 90,000 units of rental across the city. And we know that much of this is already the right supply. It's affordable to moderate and low-income earners and located in locations that are transit and amenity rich. Now is a good time to align with our senior governments. The federal government is set to finalize their national housing strategy late fall, and we've been participating in that process. We've been advocating for more investment in long-term supply of affordable rental homes, as well as demand-side measures to address the gap between housing prices and local incomes. And you'll be hearing a lot more about this in tomorrow's presentation. Now is also a good time to work with the new government in place in Victoria. We've been advocating for years to strengthen the RTA, to increase tenant protection, and to address fixed-term rent increases due to the loophole in fixed-term tenancies. And we hope to see some of these changes come to light with this new government. And in addition, we also want to make it easier to create more rental housing by requesting charter changes that will enable rental-only zones, as well as to work with the new government to explore further measures that could address speculation in the market. So this next section is about early actions. So as we draft a new housing Vancouver strategy, we've been also taking action by pivoting our existing work to better align with Housing Vancouver priorities. So the next set of slides are organized around three key themes: creating the right supply. Second is prioritizing homes first. So this is to deal with speculation and to ensure security and stability for renters, as well as to prioritize affordable housing in city processes. So in terms of creating the right supply in the right location, we've already started pivoting the Canby Corridor Phase 3 planning, where we'll be delivering a range of new housing. There'll be 11,500 units overall, with 4,200 homes over the next 10 years. And you can see from the graphic at the bottom here that it will deliver a variety of different housing forms, as well as a variety targeted to a variety of different incomes. Staff has also been enabling more choice in single and two-family neighborhoods. Today, we'll be bringing back two sets of district schedules, new duplex schedules in Granville, Woodland, and Mount Pleasant, as well as new RS district schedules through the Character Home Zoning Review. And this will enable new forms of housing in these low-density neighborhoods, so these gentle density forms that will create more options for renters and owners. Also being referred to public hearing today is the new False Creek Flats District Schedule, which will create more social and rental housing for workers and artists, an additional 1,600 homes. The Joyce Collingwood Stationary District Schedule is also being developed currently and is scheduled to come back to referral for public hearing this fall. And these new schedules will again create a variety of different housing forms, targeting a variety of different incomes between $30,000 to $150,000. VAHA, the city's affordable housing agency, will be delivering almost 900 additional homes and 7 new sites. The RFP just went out yesterday, and the homes will be targeted to a range of incomes from the most vulnerable, under $15K, to middle incomes under $100,000. So I already talked about this earlier, but we will be working to deliver a below-market rental learning pilot program this fall, and this is targeted to households earning between $30K to $80K that don't qualify for social housing but can't afford rents in the private market. And so these are really people such as artists, people working in retail and trades. We're hoping to do this through an RFP process citywide to test the industry appetite to produce this new kind of rental housing, as well as to test the different kinds of housing forms and models for guaranteeing the units. The details around location, process, and selection criteria will come later in the fall. The second theme around our early actions is prioritizing homes first and providing security and stability for renters. So we recently approved the short-term rental regulations and the empty homes tax. The objectives for both programs is to protect the supply of affordable long-term secondary rental for Vancouver residents. As both of these initiatives are new emerging policy areas for the city, we will be monitoring the impact of both initiatives and reporting back next year in terms of what changes might be needed. We will be reviewing our rate of change regulations, which require one-for-one replacement of existing rental, and prioritizing the retention and renewal of our affordable rental stock. We'll be looking at ways to encourage reinvestment in the existing stock, as well as to explore opportunities to deepen the level of affordability and increase the amount of rental when redevelopment is being contemplated. In addition, we're also working on a draft protection and retention plan for residents in False Creek South as part of the False Creek South planning program. We're also contemplating new options for shared housing to help young renters make it work in the city, and we're looking at ways to support shared living arrangements of roommates while still adhering to life safety and livability standards. The idea here for collective housing is to give renters access to larger ground-oriented secondary rental housing in established neighborhoods across the city. And we're hoping to bring back some options for changes to the zoning development bylaw later in the year. And finally, I want to tell you a little bit about actions that prioritize affordable housing in city processes. So Council passed a motion last fall asking staff to bring forward a pilot to speed up the processing time on affordable housing projects. So we have developed an affordable housing priority process that looks to increase the delivery of non-market housing, particularly on projects that have partner support. The goal is to cut down processing times by half. The initial pilot program is for 20 projects in the first 2 years, 800 of those units anticipated in 2018, and an additional 900 by 2019. And staff have developed 6 criteria to evaluate eligibility, which are listed on the screen there. Through the citywide DCL update, we've increased the proportion of funds going to replacement housing from 32% to 35%. And you'll be hearing more about this when the full report goes to Council tomorrow. And finally, Housing Vancouver also includes a number of actions that address our most vulnerable population, and staff will be bringing back more details at tomorrow's Part 2 presentation. These are the actions, so you can see what's coming tomorrow. In terms of next steps, from now until the end of the year, we'll be drafting the housing strategy, finalizing the targets and tweaking them, as well as developing an implementation and financial strategy, which we hope to bring back to Council at the end of November. While we're developing this strategy, we'll also be working on family housing design guidelines, as well as doing some work around station area planning. And trying to provide more housing around amenities and tying affordability to transit areas. So we'll be beginning initial scoping of the Broadway Corridor station area planning process, as well as starting work on the Olympic Station planning through the False Creek South planning process, as well as to assess other station area opportunities. So finally, as a summary of the presentation today, our housing crisis is driven by global, national, and regional factors. The city is taking action. We've had record rental approval starts, but our current trajectory is still not enough to prevent loss of diversity and to meet the needs of the households that are here today. We've engaged over 10,000 residents in our Housing Vancouver process and found a high degree of support for creating the right supply in the right locations, as well as to increase renter protections and to address the needs of the most vulnerable population. And we also found that there is a huge appetite for change. So our new housing targets that we presented today will help to deliver the right supply, match to incomes, and prioritize the delivery of rental housing. We also will be prioritizing the retention and renewal of existing rental housing in order to address the existing unmet need in the city. We've also been pivoting our existing work at the city in order to ensure that it better aligns with Housing Vancouver. We'll be bringing back a full housing strategy at the end of the year that will set out a broader strategy to address housing challenges across the spectrum. And in order to achieve all this, we do need to coordinate with other levels of government. That's key. And we'll be exploring opportunities to work with our new provincial government and as well to continue to provide input into the national housing strategy. Okay. Thank you.
Mayor, with your patience, I'd just like to add a concluding comment, which is that in planning, we're very happy to take the leadership to craft this overall strategy that will be continue to be refined and come forward to you by the end of the year. I think in the end, it will be comprehensive, it will be coherent, it will be ambitious, and it will be actionable. And planning will have a role in implementing a number of the policies underneath it. But I wanted to take this moment to really acknowledge that this strategy, and of course much of the implementation work, was really the product of the contributions of many of the departments in the city. And so certainly Community Services, Department of Development, Business and Licenses, Buildings and Licenses, Legal Department, Finance, Real Estate, have all been big contributors and can continue to be right up through the GM level. And of course the city manager come together very frequently on crafting this policy. So it's all being worked on by a collective of very impassioned and dedicated people here. So I often single out Edna, but Edna's got an enormous team behind her from all departments. So I just wanted to acknowledge that for you today. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Kelly and Ms. Cho. Thank you very much for the presentation and update kind of across the board on our Housing Vancouver reset. And I'll just kick off here with some questions with lots of councillors on the queue. And well, first start with a big thank you for, I know there's been an incredible amount of work done by all the staff that have been working on this across departments. So big thanks for driving the pace, and a big thanks to all the Vancouverites who've been part of this, over 10,000 people engaged in helping to shape a transformation of Vancouver's housing goals and what we need to deliver in these years ahead. So I'll just dive in with some questions, because I think overall I'm really, really impressed to see such an ambitious target. 72,000 affordable homes is a big goal for us to set for a decade. The key piece in terms of volume of that housing, I'm assuming, and it hasn't been as prominent in the report back this stage in the game, but with respect to rapid transit stations, to our rapid transit corridors, to our arterials, shopping streets on the frequent transit network, where we've had interim rezoning policy to get more density. Those are obviously where the most density can go. It currently exists in parts of the city, but there are some of these rapid transit corridors that remain relatively undeveloped and low density. So they're obviously critical for generating new rental and the big volume of numbers related to the overall 72,000. Be great to get a report back with actions we can take on that piece in September. It's great to have an update, but it would be great to have next steps, a priority for action on the places where we can and should put the most density and get units built as quickly as possible at scale. So it's great to see all these other components in the low density neighborhoods, and obviously that ties to the character home review and the work that's been going on for several years on that front to get some more housing and protect the character of those neighborhoods. But we'll look forward to September and some actions on the higher density opportunities and accelerating the pace there. I'm curious on the co-op housing front. It's been a priority for council and as an important way to get more affordable housing, a different structure with that approach, and obviously it's key to reducing speculation. Can we include a specific target on new co-op housing in our final strategy? Is that in the works now, or can we expect to see that in the fall?
So in terms of co-ops, we certainly did hear interest about that through the public engagement process, and we can look to explore that in the fall. Certainly co-ops would straddle a number of different incomes, but we'll also need to work with our provincial and federal partners to ensure that we can do that. We know that VAHA, our affordable housing agency, has delivered the Community Land Trust project, which has been working with the Co-op Federation. So that is something that we can definitely explore.
Okay, yeah, it's been good to see. We finally have a few co-ops created in recent years, with staff working really hard on that with the Co-op Federation. It'd be great to see lots more and targets around that. In terms of targets too, could you just speak to with our other big plans, the Greenest City Action Plan, Healthy City Strategy, we do have metrics and indicators for measuring our success. And I want to just be clear that we're ensuring that the final strategy will have key indicators and things like vacancy rate, tracking evictions, rental households that are close to transit, some of those, a dashboard that can be transparent and reported back on as the plan rolls out. Is that when we expect that?
Yes, we can look at all of that and report back to you what we can monitor in the fall. I mean, certainly we've been tracking the number of units that are created. We'll be looking to track the number of bedrooms. In addition, we do have a database now on how we're doing around our tenant relocation and protection plans. So we can look at that as well as look at our 311 data. Some of the other data you're talking about around evictions, we'll need to investigate further with the provincial government and through the RTB branch.
Residential Tenancy Branch, yeah. Okay. In terms of targets, I just want to ensure we're putting our priority on the lowest income housing, the most vulnerable population. Homelessness, starting with street homelessness, has obviously been top priority for us to solve, and we need, for the lowest income housing, subsidized housing, we need provincial and federal support. In terms of the targets, just want to be sure that we're putting those first in prioritization, that in the first 5 years of the plan, we put a real focus on addressing homelessness and people on fixed incomes that are going to need that subsidy. So I'm sure that we'll get more of that coming back in the fall in terms of prioritization, but I just weigh in with my voice of concern, particularly given the homelessness crisis and the pressure on our SROs and on that lowest income housing. We really need to prioritize that within the broader targets.
Yeah, I think we certainly will acknowledge that as the priority, and you'll hear more detail about that tomorrow from the Community Services presentation, the part 2 of today's update, and very active conversations, of course, with senior levels of government going on right now that will help make those priorities a reality. I wanted to come back to a couple of other points on the co-ops. Yes, of course, on the transit-oriented production of more rental housing in particular. A lot of that thinking is in the works right now, so we will be able to report on that both in the fall and make that a key part of the strategy going forward in the final strategy late fall. So.
Okay, appreciate that. And just a final question on the single-family home neighborhoods where we're seeing declining population, with the overall population increasing steadily. I know there's, with the character home opportunity, there's a chance to repopulate neighborhoods where we're seeing that decline. Just maybe if you could speak a little more to, will those neighborhoods start growing again? Will the schools and parks and services there be fully subscribed again as they once were? And is it through primarily the character homes strategy, or what's next in terms
of the
character
homes strategy is the first out of the blocks, and certainly will contribute to that in our opinion, giving many more housing options in those single family neighborhoods, so to speak. But I think that in a future phase here, and this will be articulated in the strategy as further work, we'll need to kind of take a second pass at the non-character home lots and see what other options might be available there, as well as looking again at the townhouse format and seeing where we might allocate land for that type as well.
Yeah, we do have some history here of wanting to see more row house, townhouse opportunities, particularly closest to schools and parks in those neighborhoods. And
and you'll be seeing some of that in the Canby work that's coming forward in the Municipal Town Center.
In phase 3 of Canby.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you. That's my time. It's Councillor Louis next.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And thank you also to staff. 71 slides, lots of information. And I tried to follow along on the various components which interrelate to each other. But needless to say that this is to target a equally large, if not larger, much larger issue, affordability in our city. And so just to that, the housing targets that are articulated within your presentation, it talks about 72,000 units. It's obviously to address the continuum, the larger continuum. But what's the underpinning for those assumptions on why we got to 72,000? And did it take into account, for instance, the actions that we've already taken, which is the empty homes tax to try to better utilize our existing stock, and the short-term rental component controls that we've put in place as well?
Yeah, I think, first of all, it does take that into account, although we haven't seen the end of how the empty homes tax plays out. So we'll be keeping our eye on that. I think the important message here is that the target numbers are an aspiration. What's really underneath them, you spoke about the underpinnings, is allocating that target and actions accordingly across the spectrum of income needs. And so I think that's really what's important. Frankly, an aggressive number like the 72,000, and we probably should have had one more slide, so it could have been a slide for every 1,000 units we're producing here, is really meant to give us enough production capacity to really shift substantially toward rental. To begin to balance out. And the reason for that underneath all of it is really trying to remain as diverse a city as we are today, 10 years from today, by providing affordability at various levels across the spectrum of households. And so that's really the underpinning here, is to maintain our diversity as a community.
Okay, and to that point then, the priority should be appropriately the lowest income side of the equation. And so out of that 72,000, what would you say is our initiative to deal with? Like, how many of those units are focused into that area? Well,
again, the folks particularly challenged are below 50,000. And so you'll see the income targets there that correlate. And those are mostly in the rental category, of course. And so that's the suite of action. Some of you you'll hear more about tomorrow, and some that were articulated today is making sure that as we produce more new rental housing, some of it with the assistance of senior governments, but a lot of it purely through market means, that we reserve a whole tranche of that market-produced housing for long-term affordability. And that's, again, the pilots that we're doing in Canby now, and we'll be doing potentially citywide in the coming year, is to really see how can we get the private market to produce as part of this exercise that does enhance their density and capacity.
Kelly, how do we ensure the early delivery of that component? Given that there's a need and demand right now, how do we front-end load that early, that low-income component of our housing strategy?
Yeah, well, I think that's actually what we're testing right now in the market, is how do we get that housing produced as part of any substantial rental housing project. So both by giving the incentives for rental and by reserving a piece of that. That's really kind of the forward-looking strategy we have in the rezoning work that's happening right now.
Joe would like to say something.
Through the affordable housing prioritizing process, we're hoping to prioritize the delivery of 20 affordable housing pilots, so 20 projects. So we have set 900 units hoping to come on stream next year, and an additional 1,000 approximately in 2018. So we have introduced a pilot to try to prioritize the affordability of non-market units that are currently in inquiry or application stage. So that's one thing we're doing. The other, of course, is through our Affordable Housing Agency, and they've just put that RFP process for the 7 sites, and some of those units will be targeted to the most vulnerable.
Okay, and maybe just describe to me this missing middle piece. It's a bit confusing. It talks about housing form in the slides, but also it's mixed with income component as well. Perhaps as part of your report back to us in this next stage, just to give us the clarity of what we're doing for that middle piece as well. If we talked about the low income part, we've got some priority on that, but of course that middle piece is important as well, and some clearer definition of what we're doing in that area.
Okay, yeah, point taken, and I think we mean both. We mean incomes. So when we talk about the missing middle income, we're really kind of focusing on the 30-80K, and some of the initiatives there are around this pilot for the below market rental learning pilot that we're hoping to develop in the fall. And we set a target there around 4,000 units to see what the interest is in developing those units. So that's one way of how our targets address the missing middle in terms of income, as well as through our usual purpose-built market rental. The singles units do kind of meet the 50 to 80 range, so we'll continue to be producing those, as well as units in the secondary market. So that's around the income range. As well, of course, Canby Phase 3 will also be testing out this new approach of the below market rental units through the municipal town center planning. We are also talking about missing middle forms, and so really that's not so much about affordability, but trying to diversify the type of housing in the city. We showed you in the public engagement that there's a strong appetite in the city to see that kind of form produced. Over 40% of owners and renters wanted to see that type of housing. So that's why we're taking action through the new district schedules coming today, through the RT and the RS schedules, to try to introduce more of that type of housing. And that, again, will also be a concentrated effort of delivery of townhouses in Canby Phase 3.
Okay, that's your time. Thanks, Councillor Louie. Councillor Reimer.
Thanks, Mayor Robertson. I'll just quickly echo the mayor's thanks. I know it's been a big piece of work. My questions generally focus on slides 39 to 41 about the numbers, and I'm particularly interested in numbers related to low incomes and lower income renter households. So first question was on the 12,000 social and supportive housing units, which you flagged as 50% more than the previous target. Is that because the need has doubled, or because our ability to deliver has doubled, or something I'm not thinking of?
That's because we're trying to, as close as possible, meet the try to retain the diversity in the city, and to ensure that we can have, that we're not, we're still keeping lower income households in the city. And the numbers correspond at the lowest end to the estimates that the Regional Affordable Housing Strategy indicated for Vancouver.
And the previous numbers were based on what we could deliver with a small, modest amount of provincial help and zero federal help, is that? Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. How much, you said, I think it's on slide 41, you said that it would be, the city alone could deliver 42% of the gap on the low housing geared to people with low incomes. How much is it to close the gap? It's obviously 58%, but what I'm interested in is sheer dollar figures there in to the nearest 100 million, if you want to put it in those numbers.
Well, the number would be significant,
yeah.
And we can try to bring you back more of that information at tomorrow's presentation in the part 2.
Okay, that would be helpful, because ultimately that will be what matters. It was interesting to me that it happens to be 58%, because of course the first one out of the gate would be at 58 West Hastings in terms of a fully low income building. So 30% social housing, you're piloting in the new town center planning for Oak Ridge. Would we presume then the point of the pilot would be to expand to other neighborhoods?
So, I mean, we can certainly look at that through our future planning. particularly as we look at station area planning in the future. So when we're looking at Broadway corridor or other areas, those are the areas that we could look to see if we could yield that type of mix of social housing and stratas.
And is it fair to say it would be similar or the same as the inclusionary zoning we've seen in other jurisdictions? Is it fair to call it inclusionary zoning?
We can call it inclusionary or density bonus zoning. It would just depend on how we decide to implement the strategy. We can do it through rezoning, or we can do it potentially through district schedules.
Okay. Question on the relationship between the housing geared towards higher incomes and the housing geared towards lower incomes. And I'm particularly interested in the funding relationship, like how much of this, how important is it to meet the targets for housing geared towards people with higher incomes in order to be able to deliver on the other housing in the plan?
So it's important to note that there's already a lot of units that are in the pipeline. So currently, there are already a lot of condo units that are in the pipeline. It is still important to create ownership units, because without those units, you're going to have people sort of taking up those units in more affordable options that could otherwise be freed up for lower income households. So that's one. And also, a lot of those units in the condos, they do generate a significant amount of CACs that help to pay for other amenities, including housing in the city.
Okay.
Yep.
I recently became aware, actually through this work around right supply, that when I use the term low-income housing, like a built form comes into somebody's mind. And of course, you'd never use the term high-income housing. Like that doesn't, because we presume choices that we don't presume, I think, at the lower end. So I've been trying really hard to shift my language to housing for people on low incomes, because that may constitute a variety of forms, from basement suite to the more traditional picture that pops into our head. A couple last questions, both focused on the ideas of targets and metrics. Even if we met all these targets, if we lost all of the existing rental, we have gotten no further ahead. So I'm very interested in the strategies for existing and protecting existing rental, but also existing co-op in that broader category. And I would also be interested in some thoughts around how we could innovate to track evictions. I know we don't have the direct authority, but we know that almost every eviction leads to higher rents. So it would seem to me one of the key things to be tracking.
So in terms of retaining our existing stock, that's absolutely a priority for us. As I noted in the presentation, there's 90,000 units of existing purpose-built market rental, non-market housing, as well as units that are the SRO units. And it's very important that we look at ways to reinvest in this stock. We have a study underway right now that looks at the financial impacts of reinvesting in the low-rise purpose-built rental stock and some of the challenges and costs associated with that, as well as ways to deepen the breadth of affordability when we do contemplate redevelopment in these existing rental areas. So we have done that very carefully through the West End plan and through Grandview Woodlands, where when we look at redeveloping existing rentals that are protected under a rate of change regulation, that we ensure that the units are, first of all, replaced, that there's a robust tenant relocation plan, and that we are doubling the amount of rental that's being produced. And the other option in the West End is that we've been replacing those rental units when they've been redeveloped with social housing. So we'll be continuing to look at refining those approaches further in the rate of change review process that's currently underway right now. Okay. In terms of, another question around evictions. So again, we, the city, we don't have data on evictions. That's something we're going to have to investigate further with the RTB branch in terms of how many complaints that they're getting. We can look at our 311 data to see how many people are calling us about evictions. And we can also track our tenant relocation plan data and results to show, how many tenants are being impacted by redevelopment and the ways that the city is mitigating those impacts.
Okay, thanks. That's your time. Councillor Deal's next.
Yes, thanks very much. And I will also echo what an amazing presentation, amount of work. And that's probably the most words per slide per presentation ratio we've seen yet. Some good graphics, lots of words. Well, we need some word clouds in there. So I had to choose something to focus on. So I decided to focus on ground-oriented living. And I think it was really interesting to see how people still prefer that. And I've been in some really interesting conversations with people about why some people like living in high-rises. And I'm a low-rise person, and I realize it's because I can see trees out my window. And that becomes the criteria for me, is there greenery visible from my window? As well as being able to walk outside is obviously a luxury for many. So in terms of the ground-oriented work, some of this is hard to dissect from the character home work that we're going to be talking about later in the day. But for instance, in the townhomes and our changes in the zoning that are being proposed, we currently have some townhomes and we allow them. But how would these increased targets and changes in zoning potentially change the supply of townhomes coming onto the market?
So we have a target of 5,000 units over the next 10 years.
Yep.
So right now we actually have, in the last census, it showed that we have 3% of homes in town-oriented form. So that's about 9,000, 10,000 units in the city. So adding additional 5,000 will, kind of be increasing that by 50%. So we'll be significantly adding to the share of rental of townhouses in the city, increasing that to about from 3% to 7% as an overall share.
Okay.
Townhouses.
Okay, and of course there's people who think we should have even more than that, but we'll see how this plays out. But I'm also really interested in rental townhomes. So if the province does grant us the rental-only zoning, would we look at townhouse zoning that would be rental-only as well?
I mean, we can definitely explore that if we get the changes through the through the province. We'd have to test that through economic feasibility testing. Generally, we have found that the economics haven't been working for that. Usually you need slightly higher forms to make rental work, but that's something that we can investigate further.
Okay. And that has to do with that. It's the middle income and then it's the middle size, and they're not entirely aligned.
Right.
I think that.
Yes, or you just need more units to make the performance work.
Right. Okay. There's been a proposal floating around out there that some of our builders and funding institutions and BC Co-op are interested in, with the idea of putting a covenant on adding density to lots that have character homes on them, saying that they can only get that extra density if they retain the home. And I know that that's going to be discussed a little bit, but. Are we looking at that as a possibility? Are we saying you can only add this extra suite or only stratify a new coach house if you retain the character home? Is that part of the intended outcome? Should we move ahead with the reports later today?
Good morning, Mayor and Council. Anita Malero, Assistant Director of Planning, Urban Design. In answer to your question, yes, that is the intention, that you can build an infill, but it has to be with the retention of a character house.
Right. And also potentially an extra suite in the home?
Well, currently the zonings in RS already allow a secondary suite.
Suites, yep. But maybe tertiary suites.
There are challenges with once you introduce 3 units in a house it's considered a multiple conversion dwelling,
Yeah.
and there are different building bylaw requirements.
Yeah, I know. I've read through that section several times to understand the pros and the cons of it. I appreciate that. And I was really, by the way, really happy to hear you refer to collective housing in this report. I think that's something that we need to really explore carefully here. And my final question is sort of the broader question. We've talked about ground-oriented houses, how people like the idea of coach houses and infills. They like townhouses and laneway homes. What are our next big steps in terms of potentially doing citywide zoning to change these things in the single-family zones? Because, as we know, laneway housing, we did citywide to avoid hot spots, to avoid certain areas being a focus of huge demographic and economic changes. So do we have some next big moves for citywide zoning that that could address some of these desires and concerns?
I think our first assignment here was around the character homes pieces, if you've acknowledged from past council action, so we're trying to bring that to closure now. I think, as I mentioned earlier, kind of our next look is what do we do across the whole landscape that may, for lots that don't include character homes, and how might we approach gentle density or infill on those lots, as well as looking for some of those to convert to more townhome format.
Because there's huge, yeah, okay, because there are huge areas of the city, as you know, that changed from older homes to newer ones in the 1970s and 1980s. There's
Right.
vast streetscapes that are identical 1980s versions of the specials, and so
Yes.
that would be something we would be looking at potentially in the future.
Yeah, in the future, yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Deal. Councillor DeGenova is next.
Thank you very much. I had a question regarding home ownership. When we had heard numbers probably 18 months ago from the former chief housing officer, it was my understanding that people who were making in the income bracket of $100,000 would actually be eligible to purchase, and sort of the recommendations that came forward with affordable home ownership. The numbers I see presented today are $150,000. So could you speak to why those numbers have been changed? And I also understood that the people who were in this category who wished to rent, and there were 70% of those that responded back to the survey, were actually possibly taking up rental or more affordable rental for those who could not buy. So they were actually, in a sense, overhoused, but they were in that middle in between where they couldn't purchase but couldn't rent. So could you speak to that and why the income level has increased by a third in 18 months?
So the income, when we say that for 150,000, that's for a family. So family households that are wanting to own. So in terms of singles in the city, if you have an income of 80,000, you can still get into the ownership market. So the 150 is really about families.
Okay, so we're talking 2 to 3 bedroom units. Is that what we're talking?
2-bedroom units.
Okay,
yeah,
so 2
condos,
bedroom.
townhouses.
But for one bedroom units or studios, we'd be looking at what target, because I didn't see that.
So, you know, a benchmark East Side condo, you can still afford that with an income of 80,000.
80,000.
Yep.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. And then as for collective housing, I'm glad that Councillor Jill brought this up, because I had originally brought this up to staff. I know that we have a somewhat archaic bylaw. I believe it's bylaw 3575. I've actually read it. That doesn't allow a certain number of people to live together. And I believe it actually goes on to restrict a number of people from one gender living together. So I'm just wondering what steps staff have made to move forward, and if there will be any recommendations coming to us, and if so, when, regarding changes on that front.
So we've been exploring this idea because we heard a lot about it through our public engagement, and it's primarily focused on young renters who want to live together. You're right, the sections in our zoning bylaw basically add up to the fact that you can't have more than 5 unrelated people living together. So we're exploring a number of different options on how we can move forward. One of the things that we're looking at is potentially changing the family definition of what related means, because we're in a different era now, and perhaps it's time to modernize our definition. So we're looking at those different options. One of the things we do have to be careful about is around the livability issues and around the building code. So we are investigating that further. We hope to have a memo to council potentially in the fall to look at what the different changes could be.
Okay, and until that time, I know that I myself and other councillors have been contacted by people who have lived in collective homes, and there have been complaints that they feel are unfounded, and they're worried that the city is going to come in and do an inspection. Do they need to be concerned right now if they're not, if perhaps these complaints are just because of the bylaw, because there are 5 people who aren't related living together, and there's not another reason for it, like loud parties late at night, extra garbage?
Hi, Kay Krishna, Development Buildings and Licensing.
We have not received a lot of complaints. We've received a handful, and most of them have been from other neighbors complaining about those kind of issues or the volume of people on a property and other things. So we do handle them on a case-by-case basis, and it's really ultimately up to the owner and the landlord, not the renters or the people who are in the homes. And so we typically work with them, but we've been able to work out a number of issues. We're not aggressively following up with any of those, but we handle them as we do any other complaint that we get through 311.
Great, thank you. And I'll try and put my last two questions into one. As for housing supply, you had talked about sort of the income based on the amount that people that we would be targeting on housing. Would it be staff's recommendation to tie income to market rents or to below market rents, so to tie your income to your rent? Is that a recommendation that you see coming forward? And then also I see that below market rental target of 4,000 units for those people who don't quite meet that, they don't meet low income, but they're having difficulty making it through and making ends meet to rent or buy in the city of Vancouver. Will 4,000 units meet the need? And do we expect that number to increase?
So those are good questions. We are definitely looking at different ways of how we can implement the below market rental policy in Canby, as well as through our pilot program. And the questions you raise around whether or not we'll be tying those to income is exactly what we want to do further consultation and investigation on, in terms of the eligibility requirements, how we might want to hold those rents. Is it going to be tied to the incomes, or is it going to be tied to the units? So those are all questions that we need to be exploring with both our nonprofit partners as well as with the development industry. So we've heard a lot of support for the idea from the development industry, but we really need to test their appetite for whether or not they're really interested in delivering this. And so that's why we set a relatively low target of 4,000 units, because we want to make sure that this is something that we can actually implement.
Okay.
Just the last part of my question, Mr. Mayor, if 4,000 units.
Well, I mean, the 4,000 units is also mixed with other targets within that income range to meet the need for social housing. So overall, there are an additional 5,000 units across those the 50 to 80 category that will also be met by social housing.
Okay, Councillor Carr is next.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Again, I also echo thanks very much for the incredible amount of work that's gone into this. I also want to echo comments raised by both the Mayor and Councillor DiGenova, just to say that I have a lot of interest also in the co-op housing option and also co-housing options as different models of ownership. That I'll put it up. Oh. Thank you. Secondly, to state that making sure our targets are geared to income, incredibly important. That is the goal of this housing reset. So everything that we see going forward, I'd love to see that particular relationship well established. My first question is around the targets that were stated in the report around homelessness, that we are projecting an annual increase, 6% a year. I just want to be very clear. Have we given up as a city on trying to end homelessness?
Thank you, Councillor Carr. Kathleen Llewellyn-Thomas, General Manager of Community Services. I think your question was, have we given up on ending homelessness? And certainly the answer is no, not at all. Our count this year showed an alarming rise in homelessness, and certainly a rise in the number of people who are utterly homeless. And we're looking at options going forward to find ways to rapidly house people in a housing first model, and are talking to partners about being able to implement something like that.
Yeah, I maybe just be very clear. I appreciate the honesty and the statement that we're expecting a rise in homelessness of 6% a year, but it's going to. The challenge is unbelievable. So, in 10 years, we're not looking like we're going to get there. So I just think we need to really be focused, as others have stated at this council table, on how important that issue is, not just to us at this council table, but to the city as a whole. I mean, the stats showed it. Of what was it, 43% of residents said this is a really important thing to accomplish for the good of our whole city.
Yeah.
So it's just noting it's good to see the statistic or the projection, but alarming.
I agree, and that's why, as you say, we want to be steely-eyed in it. It's why within community services, we've created a homelessness services department, which is focusing exclusively on that. And I'll be looking for making that position permanent in our 2018 budget. And there's certainly a commitment amongst the executive team and all of us in the housing business to knock that problem on the head.
Okay, thank you. A second question. I note that we, I think it's slide, not sure, 37 maybe, the major slide on housing supply that I'm quite interested in, how we're looking to project it across different income categories and numbers. And the statement that 42%, we could meet 42% of the need of households. And I believe the household range was low and moderate income. That's the 54,800. Okay, so low and moderate incomes. And I'm not sure where you're going to cut off on moderate incomes, but if we can meet 42% of 54,000, that's, I just did a rough calculation, that's 23,000 units. Does low and moderate income go up to 80,000? Is that the bottom?
Yes, it does. Yes.
Okay. There's very few projected units for the very lowest of income in here. I mean, especially other than social housing in the very bottom end, only 1,600 units are 2% of the total estimated new supply in the 15 to 30K and 4,500 in the 30 to 50K. So I'm kind of wondering if we're going to try and get 23,000 units, which is 42% of the need, is that going to mostly be in the 50 to 80,000 K bracket? So that's one sort of part of my question, or have we analyzed that? And secondly, if that's so, is it because what we can do on our own is mostly work with developers, work with the private market, which can land probably in that 50 to 80,000 K bracket more easily than it can in the other lower income brackets?
So yes, the 42% is referring to incomes under 80K, and the majority of that will be met through market rental housing in both the purpose-built and the secondary stock.
Right.
We do note that creating this new supply, while it might not be affordable today, it will become more affordable over time. We see that in our existing purpose-built market rental stock. The majority of it is over 40 years old now, and in the one bedrooms, a lot of those units actually rent at the same rate as new social housing. So, we are future-proofing and creating new supply that will become more affordable. But in terms of the need at the lowest end, we are including a very ambitious target here of 12,000 units of social housing over 10 years. And that is 50% more than our previous target. And yes, absolutely, if we are able to achieve that, that will further meet the need by 24%. But we do absolutely need support from other levels of government in order to be able to meet that need.
In the lower end, okay.
At the lower end, absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Councillor Carr. Councillor Stevenson.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor, and also add my thanks to this incredible report, really. The first part of which is difficult to hear and to realize the projection. Even though obviously it's many other cities in the world, and you hear of other cities in the world grappling, that doesn't really help you here either. So, although I wouldn't mind maybe sometime talking to you about Germany, because I understand the situation is quite different in Germany, where 80% of the people rent, and there's a whole different kind of expectation. So it'd be interesting to see how they're doing in regards to this speculation. One question that I wanted to ask to begin with pertains a lot to the West End, and I noticed in your figures that very few people, comparatively speaking, want to live in the top of high-rise buildings, either renting or buying them. And I'm wondering, is that they don't like to be up high in the air, or is it because the rents and the price of the housing up there is so substantially higher because of the views? You have any idea on that?
The way that I interpret the data is that, we have 30% of renters looking to move into a high-rise apartment in their next move. So I think that's actually, quite a substantial number. This is around preferences. So, we are seeing a lot of people saying that that is a form that they're interested in. They're just more interested in a lower rise form, but I wouldn't say that they're not interested in a high rise apartment form. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But I would imagine.
Yeah. Yeah, and the way that the question is phrased is, given your housing budget and let me just find that actually. Given your housing budget, let me just find that here. Thank you. Given your budget and housing preferences, what type of housing would you be looking for in the next move? And yeah, we did see 30% of renters, wanting to, would be considering that type of
Thinking today of the public hearing tonight of a 57-story building. And okay, what legislative changes do you think that we may need from the new BC government to attain some of the goals, some of the targets that you've spoken about?
So we've been advocating for changes to the Residential Tenancy Act for years, specifically looking at increasing tenant compensation for renters that are impacted by redevelopment, looking at offering a right of first refusal to move back to renovated units such as they have in Ontario, as well as looking to fix the loophole around rent increases that are caused by fixed-term tenancies. We're definitely not against fixed-term tenancies, but only the loophole that is there right now that allows people to increase the rental rates beyond what's anticipated through the RTA. So, we hope that with the new provincial government that we'll see some more actions there. And that would really help to stabilize the situation for tenants. Yeah, and that's really a lot of what we heard through this consultation. It wasn't just about the increase in rents. It was really about people feeling very unsure about their stability of their tenancy. And a lot of that has to do with whether or not they feel they'll need to move because the unit might be renovated, and a lot of that is to do with rent increases. So, some mitigation on both those fronts through the RTA would be immensely helpful for renters as a whole. The other change that we're hoping...
That's good. I've got a couple more questions. I know you're a fount of knowledge and you hit the right button. Now, about rental zones. I heard you address this a bit to Councillor Deal, but I'm wondering, should we be pressing the provincial government for that kind of zoning?
Yeah, so this is a change that we're requesting to the provincial government, and what it is will allow the city to zone specifically for rental. Right now, we can create rental housing either through density bonusing or through a rezoning, but we're not able specifically to zone for rental. And we're interested in doing that because that could potentially limit speculation and control land prices.
Okay. What about speculation on pre-sales? How much does that play into the problem that we have altogether? And can we work with the provincial government to change legislation there as well?
So that's definitely something that we heard through the consultation process. We've heard people talk about how there are investors that are buying up units during the pre-sale stage when the units aren't built, and then flipping them before the units are built. And that, of course, increases the price for the people who eventually end up living there. So we don't have any data around that from the city, but we're encouraged to see that in the new provincial government and their platform, they've talked about addressing this issue or exploring ways to address this issue, and we hope to be working with them to at least start collecting the data to understand what's happening.
Speaking of data.
Okay, that's your time, Councillor Stevenson. You're well over time.
We're over.
And that means we're going to
Thank you.
Councillor Affleck.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm not sure who this question, it sort of relates to Councillor Carr's points regarding the homeless numbers going up 6% predicted. That's helpful. What I think is what's most interesting, and perhaps this is a question for you, Mr. Kelly, is the numbers on slide number 30. While it's great news that Vancouver's put together over 2,200 units, here we have Burnaby at negative 478, Wyrock at negative 25, and the best second place finisher is Richmond at 307 plus, as opposed to a negative like Burnaby and Wyrock. North Vancouver 179, 93 in Delta. These are numbers that aren't even close to what Vancouver's done. It begs the question is perhaps we should not be looking to the province, the federal government right now. We should be looking to our neighbors in Burnaby, in Whiterock, in Delta, in West Vancouver, in North Vancouver. They're letting us down, and I'm wondering what conversations you're having with your friends and associates at the other cities to see if we can turn this number around, because as is the case on so many fronts in Vancouver, we can't do this alone. And clearly, it's not happening in Burnaby, it's not happening in White Rock, it's not happening in any community, and I don't think that's fair for Vancouver to take this kind of burden.
You're absolutely right, Councillor Affleck, that we cannot solve this problem alone. It is a regional problem, and we're having some informal discussions. I think our strategy, being bold, will actually help us in those regional conversations, as we have a model to point to. Because our strategy is really built around what we see as the Vancouver diversity, City of Vancouver diversity and growth trends. This needs to be echoed across the region, and so that's important at the metro, the formal metro level, as well as the city-to-city relationships. We're beginning to see those other cities step up housing production. That's not necessarily coming in the form of rental housing.
Well, clearly, I saw protests in Burnaby last night. I guess my question is, perhaps what's challenging here for us is they're just relying on us to take care of it for them. Mm-hmm. Burnaby gets to reduce their number by almost 500 over the 6 years. Mm-hmm. We increased 2,200. They're going, great, thanks very much, Vancouver, taking care of that. And we're also spending millions and millions of dollars on homelessness. People are coming to Vancouver because we're taking all the burden here in Vancouver. And I don't think we should be having stronger conversations with these other leaders in the other communities. Mr. Mayor, this is your job. Why is Burnaby letting us down, Mr. Mayor? Why is Delta? Why is Richmond? Why are they not doing their fair share? And I would just ask that you please go speak to your compatriots, your buddies there on the other cities, because this seems to be a major problem for the region. Yeah. And I don't want to dwell on it. So that really jumped out at me. I'm sorry. The other question I have regarding is we've had programs for several years now, Rental 100 being the most recent one. Are we seeing a lack of interest by the private development community in this program? And we've seen 2,200 units, but we're tweaking other programs. We're looking at trying to encourage private sector. I'm wondering if that's going to work, and I assume we're going to add significant density if they put this rental units in. The mayor's announcement on Sunday, it sort of alluded to that. Right. But are we seeing a sort of a less interest in the Rental 100 program, and so therefore probably a decline in the numbers on that front and that program?
I'm not sure there's been a decline in the interest in that program. I think that what we are seeing is an appetite on the part of the private sector to build more rental housing than before. And that's been a big change, I think, over the last year or so. And there are a lot of institutional investors who are behind them in that are interested in holding long-term income-producing assets. Rather than turn their money quickly in a condominium development, here's an ability for those investors to have a long-term asset that will produce predictable income over a period of time. And so you're seeing a lot of the pension funds and REITs, for example, being willing to be equity partners in rental housing, which is Not something we've seen as strongly as we're indicated, as the interest is being indicated now for us. So I think that gives a lot of faith to the local developers about who their partners will be to venture more deeply into the rental housing production.
I mean, there's so many questions I have regarding that as far as, for example, if it's a rental-only building and it's a private development and it's a mix of units that are subsidized, who is subsidizing them? Will it be the people who are paying the market rent in the rest of the building, or will the person who owns the building be forced to provide the subsidies to those units that are meant to be at that 30% income rate?
Well, there are a couple different models being looked at here. The one that we've been describing today really kind of fits more in the density bonus category, where essentially it is paying, they could build the lower scale building, but it's actually more in their interest to go higher and to reserve a certain number of those units as affordable. In other words, it pencils within the project. It's not a penalty there because they're able to recoup that through more density on the site. And on the, I just got a note from Edna here that there actually were 2,000 rental units approved just last year in that Rental 100 program. So we are seeing some sustained interest there.
Okay.
Those are not all construction starts yet, but they were in the approval process.
And just one more question, if I may, Mr. Mayor, that everybody else was allowed around 6 minutes. If I may, just one question regarding the survey itself. I'm not sure if it'd be you or so. Just it was interesting that there was 10,000. It's okay? Sorry.
Just make it quick. You're
yeah, 10,000 participants, 62% of them were renters, majority were under 40. These are interesting. This is interesting data. We would like to see an election to return like that with, in Vancouver. I'm just wondering how we managed to do that. Where did these people come from? Why were they suddenly interested in this? What did we do to get such a specific audience to respond to this? And I'm wondering if it was weighted disproportionately because of that towards renters or towards any data that might have been skewed because of that.
No, so we didn't weigh the responses differently. There was a variety of different ways that we reached out to people. The surveys where we got the majority of responses was an online survey, so that could speak to preferences around who participates. We also did a big push through social media, a significant push. So that was another way we got the message out through Facebook, through social media. And I think that it just is really speaking to who the housing crisis is impacting today, compared to 5 years ago, where people were, there was a lot of owners who were, interested in additional ownership options, and people just talking about lower income rental units. Over the last 5 years, we've really seen this change to broaden to all Vancouverites, specifically within this sort of younger category of people really feeling priced out of the market. So I think that because the crisis is sort of is impacting more residents across the board, that's really why you're seeing more people under 40 and more renters participating in this process. I forgot to mention in the presentation, we do have the full version of the engagement results online, so we can send those to you as well. It's a big document.
Okay, that is all the questions. Thank you very much again to staff for the big comprehensive update on the housing reset, and we will look forward to being back here with you in September for the next set of actions and updates on all the work that's taking place. Thanks again for everyone that's been involved in the Housing Vancouver front, working to make sure we have a great housing policy going forward that meets the needs of people in Vancouver. Thanks again, staff, and we will stay tuned tomorrow morning. We have the second part of this update as well. So we'll bring that to committee tomorrow morning. And that means we're going to move on. The second report reference, we referred to hearing the presentation and speakers tomorrow morning at the committee meetings. So that means we're moving on to hear, to deal with the reports that Council held for debate or questions to staff. And the first of those is Councillor Carr wanted Administrative Report number 3. And let me cue you up here on the mic, and that is the grant application for launching a Resilient Neighbourhoods program. Councillor Carr.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, so I'm sorry. Oh, great. Okay, thank you. So my questions really have to do around the fact that this report, which is great, you know, in terms of moving forward, but I did feel that there was not very much emphasis on what I think might be a much more common set of emergencies and disasters that are climate related. So I looked carefully through the report for, you know, the kind of agencies that we're partnering with around, there's many that have earthquake preparedness as part of it, but I'm really searching for the ones where we're going to get some grasp of the climate science and the need to, because sharing information is part of these pilots. Specifically around flooding, heat waves, ice storms, winter storms, those kinds of things.
So thanks through the chair. Thanks for that question, Councillor Carr. Absolutely, the climate and the risks and hazards posed by climate change and the kind of pressures that come with that, I think are definitely part of what we're looking at here. We're able to get some traction around seismic, but really the work that we're going to be doing and each of these communities are going to be doing around resilience applies to any type of crisis or disaster, whether those be natural disasters, seismic events, weather, or other social issues. The capacity that we're looking to build here will apply equally. And we think as we get into this, probably some of what we expect to is those neighborhoods will be really identifying themselves what they see as their major issues or challenges. And we expect some of those will be weather related or climate related as well.
Right.
So it's not exclusive. I think seismic is the first, you know, the primary driver for this, but the work that's going to come out of it and the benefits that we're going to get will apply to all those range of issues.
The reason why I think it's really important to consider this, I've read the, you know, the reports on, for example, heat waves, power outages as a consequence of climate related, and the vulnerability, especially of seniors and people who are less mobile in high rises, you know, without water, without food, without medication. So I've got that heavy on my mind as I ask the questions and make sure that that's part of.
Certainly. So we'll take that recommendation and we'll ensure as we roll this out that we're not excluding that and that we're working with those neighborhoods to really think about those types of issues as well. I think it's a great point.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. And I have questions as well on this and would be happy to move the recommendations following that if there are no further questions. But just in terms of staff, the staff complement that's focused on emergency management and who will be engaged in this piece around the Resilient Neighborhoods program, can you just speak to the departments involved and kind of the scale of activity and number of staff that are involved across departments?
Certainly. So within our emergency management, Office of Emergency Management, we do have 2 to 3 positions that are focused on kind of neighborhood or community resilience. We, of course, now have the Chief Resilience Officer role that's been funded for 2 years through the 100 Resilient Cities program. So Katie McPherson has really been spearheading this particular piece of work. This goes beyond the capacity of our Office of Emergency Management to support. They do this kind of work. They're supporting, of course, our Vancouver Volunteer Corps, our Neighborhood Emergency Preparedness Program. I think what we're really looking to do here is leapfrog or springboard off of that to a much more substantial initiative. So it would be led over the next 2 years by Katie in her capacity of Chief Resilience Officer with some additional temporary staffing support, 2 positions focused purely on this pilot program.
Okay. And in terms of the volunteer base and the number of citizens here in Vancouver that are engaged in it, can you just update us on Vancouver Volunteer Corps and the other Vector, the other resident programs that are volunteers in this front?
I'd have to get back to you with a specific number. My understanding right now is it's in the neighborhood of 700 to 800 volunteers that we're currently managing across the different components of our Vancouver Volunteer Corps program, which include Emergency Social Services, Vector, our Neighborhood Emergency Preparedness Program, and the Disaster Assistance Team. So there are sub-programs within that. Vancouver Fire plays a big role as well in working with Office of Emergency Management and supporting that program. So fire is a big part of that. Of course, both Emergency Management and Vancouver Fire now report to Daryl Reed. So that's a new alignment, and one of the things he's going to be looking at will be that program overall, how it's working, and looking at how we can continue to leverage it moving forward.
Okay, and finally, just a question in terms of earthquake preparedness in particular, and the opportunity to do bigger and more robust drills, mock earthquakes, so that we are prepared, not only here in Vancouver, but ideally we would have a more regional approach to this and the provincial government involved. I know there's been discussions about doing more work on this to get more full-scale simulation and test our systems on this. Can you just speak to where that's at and whether this new program dovetails with that work?
So we are now beginning the planning for that. Those exercises involve a significant lead time and resources to plan and carry out. The province, of course, conducted the kind of first real full-scale major exercise in Port Alberni, and our heavy urban search and rescue team was part of that. So that functionality and the capacity has been tested recently there. We were and have been in discussions with the province about their next major exercise, and I think the challenge is we understand that they were looking at the Lower Mainland as the base for that next exercise. Obviously, it would be great to align with them. I think our challenge is that they are probably looking at a couple of years out yet, and we would like to move quicker than that. So our staff are now starting that process of preparing, scoping what that exercise would look like and take. We're hoping that if 2018, I think, was what we're looking at right now to see whether we can pull that off. There are budget implications and so on. So that planning is underway now. And again, if there's opportunities to align with Metro or IPREM or the province, we'll be looking at that as well.
Okay, well, I'd certainly be wanting to advocate for that with the new premier and with mayors around the region. We'll just keep the pressure on, because the sooner we do a big exercise at regional scale, the better. But if we can't pull that off, it would be great to do as large as we can here within the city of Vancouver, so we have a better sense of our preparedness and what else we need to do. Okay, I appreciate that. Looks like it's got a couple more questions on the queue here. Councillor Affleck.
Just regarding, first of all, this report comes as a result of us bringing in a Chief Resilience Officer, which came as a bit of a surprise. That's a funded position from which Rockefeller Institute, or?
Yes, Rockefeller Foundation.
So that's valued at how much?
The salary for that position is roughly, including benefits, is roughly $130 a year for 2 years of funding.
Okay, and then other staff are being brought on to take care of this program as well, that are new staff, or?
Yeah, what we would be seeking here would be, there's 2 additional temporary staff. We've got some money from the province that will cover one of those. So overall, we'd be looking for 1 more net new staff member, temporary.
Would any of this work if we hadn't brought in this Chief Resilience Officer? But to me, it seems like a lot of the stuff that we do in the city should be focused on resilience and dealing with this stuff. And so this position, which came as a surprise, I'm wondering what we weren't doing it before, or who was doing it before this person was put in place and funded by an American nonprofit.
The Office of Emergency Management does do work around community resilience. And in fact, Katie McPherson, in her prior role in the Office of Emergency Management, this was part of her portfolio. What we now have here, with the opportunity of the partnerships that she's been able to pull together, is a much more intensive, focused effort to really accelerate the work that we're doing in the community. I think our and the benefit of this approach, I think the advantage we see, which will be borne out in time, is what we're doing here is leveraging the capacity of community organizations that really are interested and are already doing work in this field. The city can do so much, and we are continuing that work. Our Office of Emergency Management is continuing the work that they do. This really is providing capacity to community organizations to do grassroots work that our staff can't do. So it's support for the community.
Right, and it's on paper it's very appealing. We're investing $600, we're getting $1.1 million in back, but it's quite a lot of it is staff time from all these organizations that you've calculated or somebody's calculated the value of staff time.
Yes.
Who calculated that number? How did that number?
That was worked out in conjunction with those partners.
Okay. There's a couple of ones on there. $600,000 in kind of research invested to create earthquake risk. This is from Natural Resources Canada. Risk model of Lower Mainland that will be applied to digital tool developed in Vancouver. So can you tell me a bit more? It's not really $600,000 that we're getting. It's a tool that already exists. Can you just elaborate on that one?
It's an in-kind contribution, which I think the program contemplates, the Innovation Fund. This is work that NRCan has done, and what we're looking to do is leverage that research and data to provide it to community organizations and citizens in the way that they can actually use it. So that's the $25,000 contribution that we would be making. Right. To develop essentially an interface or a platform for people to access that information in a user-friendly way.
And that was a prior investment, it says at the top.
They have done that research, yes.
So when we say 1.1 million, it's a bit, I mean, that's not really what we're getting as far as, I mean, that was prior investment. I'm just curious with these numbers. To me, it seems like that's prior, so that really takes us down to $600,000 in committed, and then it's staff time that's being calculated by somebody. Is there any cash being provided here by anybody?
The province has provided the city with $100,000 in cash. Our understanding of the Innovation Fund is it does contemplate in-kind contribution.
Okay, and those community groups, the Dunbar, Britannia, how connected are they to this program, and are they aware they're getting these checks for
absolutely
$1,000 and pretty excited about it? And
this program and this proposal has been developed in partnership with those organizations.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Councillor DiGenova, questions?
I do. I have a few questions. I'm wondering, our Chief Resiliency Officer that has just recently been employed through this donation that Councillor Affleck had outlined, have they directed or started any grant writing to the Vancouver Foundation? I see here that we're leveraging some money, but I also see some monies that we would be actually quite a bit of money that we'd be looking at spending, like $300,000 in recommendation D for staffing and resources to back this up. So I'm wondering, has there been any grant applications before this came to council looking outside for that money? Organizations such as the Vancouver Foundation that does grant for purposes such as this?
So there's been a lot of discussion with the province, $100,000 contribution from the province. With the federal government, NRCan, there has not been a grant application made to the Vancouver Foundation.
Have there been other grant applications made to other nonprofit organizations that could have possibly funded this?
Well, the partners that are listed here, that's the significant contributions that they're making to this program to make it happen. That's where the conversation has been focused.
I was specifically looking at recommendation D for the $300,000 in staffing costs for this to be carried out?
No.
Okay. So there were no grant applications made?
We're not aware at this time of grant funding that would be available to cover that. That's, I think, the purpose for the Innovation Fund request.
Okay, and then we already have an excellent, you come to us with our city manager, we get an excellent update on where we're at with emergency preparedness in the city of Vancouver. I know we have the HUSAC team, currently some of them are fighting the wildfires. I'm just wondering where this fits into what they have done, and have they been consulted with that? Vancouver Fire, all of the other organizations that are a part of that in moving forward, because I do, in looking at earthquake strategies, I know that fits into what we already do, and we already have a pocket of money that we reserve for that through our emergency preparedness strategies.
So this is really in addition to the work that the city's already doing. What we do know from research is that most citizens in Vancouver are not prepared for a major emergency. We saw that this past winter, even in relation to snowfall. Our citizens are, in many cases, woefully unprepared. This really is focused on community level activity to engage people in planning and preparing, supporting their neighbors at the local neighborhood level. So the city will continue to do the work that we're doing, supporting our disaster hub program, all of the work that our Vancouver Volunteer Corps, the Vancouver Fire and Rescue Services do. This is really looking to engage the community in this, and I think what we've seen and evidence is shown in other cities is that This is the type of initiative where you actually can get communities involved in a way that will make a difference in building their resilience.
Okay, thank you. Another question that I have in regards to that is you had mentioned, I suppose, the past winter conditions as, I suppose, a test of how prepared Vancouverites or residents were here. I'm just wondering, would that be the best example recently that you would see of sort of an emergency situation? Would we have classified that as a situation where some residents found themselves in a situation of emergency, or they weren't able to access the services they may need in an emergency?
I think that, that in the scheme of crises and disasters, that wouldn't rate as a disaster. I think what it showed is that people weren't prepared for circumstances out of the ordinary. A major seismic event or a major weather event. We had the windstorm in 2015 as well. So there's been a number of incidents that have been relatively moderate in terms of severity, but have shown the impact that these have on communities. And again, unfortunately, a lot of our residents and businesses as well in our community are not well prepared for a major disaster.
And just one more question. I know the Innovation Fund has been asked for a lot, there's a lot of asks, it seems to me, that come out of the Innovation Fund here and there. Recently, one of those was for the opioid overdose crisis. So in putting this in the level of priority as to what we need to focus on right now, would you say that we'll ever be short dollars for things that we need in the Innovation Fund, and that this is a top priority right now over other things?
Councillor, I can't speak to the opioid fund. I know
there's
the
example.
contingency fund was set aside by council as a separate fund from the innovation fund. So this is a separate pot of money from the funds that were allocated to the opioid crisis. So I think certainly that is a different level of severity, and as indicated by council's decision to set aside a specific contingency fund for that. We do see this as important. I think around our emergency preparedness, the city's done a lot of work, and we're continuing to do that. We're well positioned in terms of the city and our capacity. You referenced HUSAR. That certainly sets us apart. Where we're, I think, challenged to make headway is at the level of citizen and business resilience at a neighborhood level. So people looking after themselves, their families, their neighbors. This is the type of activity that other cities have shown. San Francisco, Seattle, Wellington, Calgary, this type of program is the type of program that makes a difference.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Ball, questions?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for the report. I just had two questions. Looking at the bottom of 10, it mentions $50,000 coming in from Resilient Cities platform partners, and it quantifies it as $50,000 there, the value of services available. And then on the next page, on 11, it mentions the Resilient Cities member network and not quantified, and then lists a number of, could you, just because I'm getting a little confused here as to what the 50,000 is covering that the not quantified is not?
Certainly. Through the chair, Councillor, the platform partners, through their 100 Resilient Cities program, we have access to essentially consulting services that are funded by the 100 Resilient City program that we can access at no cost to the city. So these are major consulting firms that do work in this area. That's the estimate there with respect to the platform partners. The 100 Resilient Cities member network is what we see as potential value through relationships with other cities that are part of the 100 Resilient Cities network. We've already benefited significantly through work with San Francisco. They came and were part of the two workshops that are referenced in this report at Britannia, where we're leveraging work that they've done in San Francisco, approaches that they've adopted there, and trying to apply them here. We've also, like I say, seen and do anticipate the potential for real benefits working with other cities that are attempting to do the same thing that we're trying to do here. Seattle, Calgary, Wellington, New Zealand is another city that's done a lot of work around neighborhood resilience. Katie McPherson is actually in New York presently for a global meeting of her counterparts. It's a meeting that's being funded by 100 RC. This is one of the major things that they're talking about there. So she's looking at how can we work with other cities and take ideas and potentially use some of their staff knowledge, some of their staff time. San Francisco, their staff came up here to work with us on this. So we haven't put a dollar value to that, the value of that, but we do see that there is real benefit that we're going to be able to achieve working through the 100 Resilient Cities Network with other cities that are doing similar programs.
Okay, thank you. I had one more quick question. I think I've just got enough time here. The budgeting for each separate neighborhood is, sometimes $10,000 difference. I'm just wondering where those changes in the budget came. Did that come through consultation with the neighborhood as to what they needed, or what made the $10,000 difference is what I'm interested in.
Certainly. At Britannia
Yes.
Is the one where there's an additional 10,000. Britannia is further along in this work. They're making a more significant contribution in that community. And there is a test case there that we're going to engage in around the placement of an shared equipment shipping container. So the funding will be allocated to that. So there's some additional work going on in Britannia that's warranting that additional 10,000.
So just so that I understand it, we received a grant to hire a person, and that person oversees new spending that we need to add in. Having received that grant, we need to have the work that this person is to do, the resilience officer. We need to fund that, just so that I understand the flow of money.
No, I don't think that's the case, Councillor. If we didn't have the Chief Resilience Officer, this is still work that we would be looking to do. I think what we have now is someone who has the capacity and the skill set to lead this work.
That's what
Katie was in emergency management before, that this work would have fallen to her in that role. So we just have more capacity now to do this.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, that is all the questions. I'm happy to move the recommendations. If someone would second, Councillor Carr will second. Any debate on the motion? Councillor Reimer?
Yeah, I'm going to rise to support it. As noted in the report, this work goes back to December 2013 when we first developed the earthquake preparedness strategy and identified the need for disaster support hubs at the neighborhood level and how critical that would be to successful response and recovery from a disaster of any kind, but particularly an earthquake. And I know last April in 2016, we were, the first phase of the disaster support hub came in, and I know it's in the communities, particularly Britannia, it's definitely, knocking on wood and thanking God, we have not had an earthquake yet to test it at its full capacity, but these hubs have great benefits that go well beyond earthquake preparedness in terms of building resilient communities at the social level. And given, I think Councillor Carr referenced climate change, this summer, the heat, if you're low income and living in housing that wasn't designed for this kind of heat, you're already experiencing some trauma and a sort of a personal level of disaster that these kinds of resiliency supports can make a big difference on. Not as bad as 2009, where we actually lost someone to the heat wave down in that community, but why not build the capacity to be able to ensure that those kinds of disasters in communities don't have disastrous impacts on the residents? So I wanted to thank staff. We are light years ahead of where we were in 2009. I know it's been a incremental progress, but thanks to some external funding, we can speed it up and hopefully ensure that the supports are in place before we need them.
Thanks, Councillor Reimer. Councillor Affleck, to the motion.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Mayor. If I could ask to sever D out from A, B, C, and D, it's a separate vote. While I think there are lots of positive attributes to this report and that it's important that we be prepared, I find that the extensive cost for staffing is not necessary. I think it's possible that we could potentially use some of the communication staff. We have around 43 of them now in the communications department, that perhaps we could utilize some of those staff to deal with the communications and the strategy around that, and have our Chief Resilience Officer oversee those staff members in order for us to implement that. So I'll support A, B, and C, but won't support D. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor DiGenova.
Thank you. I was also going to ask for D to be severed out for some of the same reasons as Councillor Affleck. Also for the reason that right now we find ourselves in a situation, I think Councillor Carr brought it up in the last report, have we given up on homelessness? No, we haven't. But as we heard from our Director of Community Services, unfortunately those numbers keep increasing and keep going up. So spending $300,000 which is half of what we're being asked, I think, tomorrow to consider for the opioid crisis, and considering the Innovation Fund. I've seen a lot pulled from the Innovation Fund. I'd love to see the budget for the Innovation Fund right now, considering all of the monies that have been allocated from that and where we're at with the balance. But for that reason, I can't support D. And I would hope that we'd be able to, as Councillor Affleck had said, perhaps find some staff from within that we would be able to utilize for these projects. So I certainly will, I certainly support C. And I think that it's great to empower certain neighborhoods and communities. And I'll be supporting A and B as well, but I cannot at this time support D. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll just make some final closing comments before we go to a vote. Well, I'm disappointed to hear we don't have unanimous support for investing in the Resilient Neighborhoods program and the most robust possible response to emergency, to disaster, to earthquake, to chaos in our communities. I think staff have worked really hard on building this program up as a proposal. We've done a ton of work over certainly in my time here, and members of council who've served since 2008. This has been a huge priority for us to gear up and be prepared for a worst case scenario with earthquakes primarily, but certainly other disasters that can affect us, and to ensure that there's a broader base of resilience in neighborhoods around the city. Whether it's with heat waves, whether it's cold and snow. We face our challenges increasingly, and we need to be prepared as a city, certainly at the neighborhood level. So I think these are incredibly important investments, and kind of shocked to hear that some councillors don't see the merits in work that staff have done, extensive work that staff have done to scope this out and figure out what we do need to staff up and support efforts at a local and neighborhood level. Ultimately, this will empower many residents here in Vancouver to be prepared and work together when disaster strikes or when there are big stresses on the community. So I think it's a really essential investment. Appreciate all the work done to prepare this and make sure that we are being as pragmatic as possible. Noting we are very careful with our budgets, but we have to be sure we're ready for adversity to strike, and I think the work's been done to make that case. So thanks to staff for all the work up on this and all the progress over the years across the city to be better prepared for emergencies and be more resilient as a city. Okay, we're ready to go to a vote. On the A through C first. Recommendations A through C. And we have all 9 votes in favor. Unanimous support for A through C. So we'll go to the vote on D, recommendation D. The resources for the development and delivery of the Resilient Neighborhoods program is detailed in the report. And I don't know what happened there. I didn't get a chance to vote. Folks could vote again. Don't have Reimer, Ball, or DeGenova. Okay, we have 6 votes in favor and Councillors Ball, Affleck, and DeGenova in opposition on recommendation D for Resilient Neighborhoods, but that motion recommendation carries. So we have completed that item, Administrative Report number 3. It is just after 12 noon, so that means it's time to recess for lunch and in-camera meeting, meaning we will come back at 2 o'clock for the unfinished business item that we said we would do at 2 o'clock. That's the rezoning for Pearson Dogwood on 57th and Cambie. And following that, we will be back to Administrative Report number 5 that's being held for debate and questions, and the balance of the agenda from there. Councillor Reimer, you're on the queue. Did you have a question about that?
I just wanted to flag for council that the speaker has withdrawn, but she did send in a letter, and I forwarded it to all of you, so it would come in under my email address. I'll
Yep.
tell you afterwards, Councillor Stevenson.
We got an email from the speaker on A5 on the waterfront initiative. Okay, so council can review that on the break. Okay, we're ready to recess. We will be back at 2 o'clock.